Great. Thank you so much, Fawaz, for organizing this session. Thank you also very much, Sadiqa, for inviting me. It's been a really, really great honor to have my work featured on your wonderful website, but also to be speaking with all of you. My understanding is that most of you here are undergraduate students at universities in Pakistan who are interested in becoming science writer or in writing about science. Is that right?
Yes, Professor Jörg. Most of our cohort participants are undergraduate students. Some of them are in postgrad studies, but 60 to 70% of our cohort participants are undergraduate students, and one is a postdoc, one is a PhD, and one is a very younger one. He's I guess 13 or 15, but he is very passionate about his Yamin. So the cohort is, but the median lies between undergraduate students, and I would like to welcome Professor Jörg on Scientia Science Writing Internship Cohort 3. Thank you, Professor Jörg, for joining us. And over to you. Please tell us about yourself and your work. Welcome to Scientia.
Thank you so much. My name is Jörg Matthias Determann. I'm a historian of science who is specializing in the history of astronomy. And most recently, I wrote a book on diversity, equity, and inclusion in astronomy. And I'm very, very happy to share with you some of that research, but hopefully also give you some advice on how to write about this kind of topic. So what fascinates me about astronomy, among other things, is that it is a very inclusive subject. So astronomy has perhaps existed for as long as human beings have looked up at the sky and wondered and told stories about the sky. So probably since the very beginning of humanity, you will find knowledge about the sky, stories about the sky in every culture, in every civilization, and in every human group probably that has ever lived. Which also means if you're writing about astronomy, you probably always have an audience. So you will always find readers who are interested in learning more about the stars. These are just some of the books here: African Cultural Astronomy, The World at Night, and then also giant telescopes here. There's a big field of literature called the History of Astronomy. So I know our last session was about writing book reviews, so you can find plenty of material if you're interested in writing reviews of astronomy books. I mentioned that astronomy is very inclusive. However, it also has exclusive aspects in the sense that it is very close to physics. Right, there's this field called astrophysics that is also part of physics. And physics has a close relationship in many countries with the military-industrial complex, with secrecy. It's often big science involving big money on often remote locations. So we're talking about giant telescopes, high on mountaintops, away from most human settlements. Sometimes we're talking about space telescopes. So as much as astronomy is inclusive, we also have these elements that make it a concern of the few at the same time, an elite science. And physics more broadly is often associated with elitism. That tension between inclusivity and exclusivity, a science that is for everybody, but sometimes is also a science that is just for the few, I think is interesting for me, but it might also be of interest to many of your writers. I mentioned that that it is very inclusive. So astronomy, it studies the sky, which is in principle open to everybody. So no country can monopolize access to the stars, access to the sky. And of course, countries can gain a lot from collaborating with one another. Because the Earth, of course, turns. So it's always becoming day somewhere or night somewhere else, which means if you're trying to observe a star and then dawn happens, the sun rises where you are, you can't observe that star anymore because it's getting day at your place. However, you can continue observing that star somewhere else on Earth. So where you stop, another observatory can pick up, making astronomy ideal for international astronomical collaboration. I mentioned that people from all cultures have engaged in astronomy, have created knowledge about the stars. And this also includes people of almost all identities. So we have, for instance, not just men in astronomy, but a really, really long tradition of women in astronomy going back not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years too. Here are books, some of them are biographies, for instance, Vera Rubin, A Life, which is about the astronomer, the female astronomer, whose name was given to the observatory that you see in the background of my presentation. So astronomy is really a subject that, whether you're interested in male scientists or female scientists, you can find interesting lives of scientists that contributed to this research. We can also find people of all ethnic groups. I showed earlier on a book about African cultural astronomy, so we can have astronomy in all parts of the world, in all regions, on all continents, and also among all minority groups. So for instance, in America, as you know, the African Americans were historically very oppressed, were marginalized, but that did not contribute, that did not prevent them from contributing to science, even a science that is sometimes considered elite. So if you look at, for instance, Nobel Prizes for physics, first of all, Nobel Prizes in physics, almost all of them have gone to men. And this week as well, if you followed the Nobel Prize ceremony, but of course, women too contributed to astrophysics and astronomy. And yes, Nobel Prizes were often won by people from dominant groups, elite groups, people who had access to elite higher education, but not exclusively. So we have, again, going back hundreds of years as well, people from minority groups, from marginalized groups, studying the stars, being interested in the stars, and their stories are increasingly documented in books like this. Finally, we also have disabled people contributing to the stars. So perhaps one of the most famous contributor to astrophysics, who with a very visible disability, is Stephen Hawking, somebody who spent most of his career in a wheelchair. However, he still contributed enormously, for instance, to our understanding of black holes and of cosmology more broadly. And if you haven't watched that particular film, The Theory of Everything. I recommend it to you. It's a wonderful biography of one of the most important disabled physicists, and also one of the maybe most famous contemporary scientists who did not win a Nobel Prize. Stephen Hawking is a very famous example. However, there are also other important scientists that have been covered recently. For instance, Wanda Diaz-Merced, who is a blind astronomer who works on sonification, so turning data into sound. So as you probably know, most observatories these days are computerized, research observatories that is, and these telescopes essentially collect light and process them in the form of bits and bytes, so computer data. Now this computer data can be represented visually, so you can have a photograph of the universe, of the stars, as like you're taking one with a digital camera, but of course any form of data you can also display in other ways. One of them is of course through sounds. You can associate certain sounds with forms of data, and then you essentially get a music of the spheres. You get different kinds of patterns of sounds, and just like scientists study patterns in images, we also can study patterns in sounds. So there's no reason why a blind astronomer cannot contribute very much to. Finally, if you go back into history, there are lots of examples of disabled astronomers. Here's one from the BBC News website on John Goodrick, the deaf astronomer. It is probably still true that if you are lucky to live long enough, you will probably encounter some form of disability at some point in your life. So if you have a long life, the chances are likely that at some point you will have a mobility impairment or a visual impairment or a hearing impairment. And of course, this is also true for astronomers who lived in history. So for instance, Galileo at some point lost a lot of his vision. And so did Johannes Kepler as well. So there are many examples of famous disabled astronomers, I think, whose stories can be very inspirational. So if you want to tell as a science writer the story of a scientist who has overcome a lot of challenges, including physical challenges, including challenges of disability, I think this is of a lot of interest to a broad audience. I mean, like I said, I wrote this book about diversity, equity, and inclusion in astronomy. And in this book, I was less interested in just an individual life. I didn't just want to pick one astronomer and tell their story. But we have a lot of books already that focus on one particular astronomer's life. Instead, I was interested in the history of a broader social movement that has challenged the elitism of physics. A broader social movement that has tried to make astronomy more diverse, more equitable and inclusive. But this movement has connected many people, not just women, not just disabled astronomers, not just astronomers from but various minority groups, but across these various different groups often, and brought them together. So we've had conferences on women in astronomy, for instance, at the Space Telescope Science Institute in 1992. If you don't know the Space Telescope Science Institute, that's the institute that manages the Hubble Space Telescope and also the James Webb Space Telescope, the JWST. There was also an inclusive astronomy conference in Vanderbilt University in the United States in 2015. And then in 2019, we had the International Astronomical Union organize a symposium on astronomy for equity, diversity, and inclusion. So you can see there are meetings in different countries bringing in people who are interested in broadening access to astronomy. These conferences didn't just involve presentations and panels and discussions, but they often produced white papers as well, or manifestos. So for instance, the Women in Astronomy meeting in 1992, which was held at the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore, Maryland, resulted in the Baltimore Charter for Women in Astronomy that began with what is called here an ancient Chinese saying, but it's actually a quotation from Mao Zedong, an important communist leader of China: "Women hold up half the sky," reminding us, of course, that women are half of humanity, and women can contribute equally to all human endeavors, including astronomy. And this document was produced over 30 years ago, so I would assume that before many of you were born, but still there are many statements in here that probably still resonate today, like women and men are equally capable of doing science. Diversity contributes to rather than conflicts with excellent science. However, current recruitment, training, evaluation, and award systems often prevent the equal participation of women. And already over 30 years ago, there were important recommendations, for instance, affirmative action, how the institutions should make serious goals in order to hire more women, have greater representation and greater diversity in science. That women should participate in the selection process of candidates as well. Here it says again, and this is from 1992, so long ago, strong action must be taken to end sexual harassment, for instance. But gender-neutral language and illustrations are important. Physical safety is of concern to all astronomers, and of particular significance to women who often feel more vulnerable when working alone on campus or in observatories, right? So obviously, historically, a lot of astronomers worked at night. So physical safety for women has been a perhaps more important issue in astronomy than elsewhere. You can see, even though this particular manifesto was produced decades ago, we still have work to do. We still have to end sexual harassment in most countries of the world, if not all of them. In 2015, this inclusive astronomy workshop also produced a manifesto or a Magna Carta or a white paper called the National Recommendations, where, for instance, here it became clear that that it was not just women who were discriminated, but people of various identities. So people of color, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, intersex, queer, questioning, asexual, LGBTIQA people, people with disabilities, women, people disenfranchised by their socioeconomic status, and everyone who holds more than one of these underrepresented identities in the astronomical community. So a lot of astronomers have increasingly realized that a lot of people from various different groups have encountered oppression, and that these groups should work together in order to make astronomy more democratic more accessible, more inclusive. And this document is again came up with recommendations, for instance, removing barriers, creating inclusive climate. Improving inclusion and access to power, policy, and leadership, and establishing a community of inclusive practice. These conferences were often one-time events. At other times, they were part of a series, and they also resulted and strengthened in committees that would give these events some continuity. So, for instance, the American Astronomical Society has various committees for women, for minorities, of gender-based minorities, as well as race or ethnic-based minorities. The American Astronomical Society has a working group on accessibility and disability. The International Astronomical Union also has various working groups. Then there are amateur groups as well, like Astronomers Without Borders. And I'm giving you these examples because if you're interested in, let's say, interviewing somebody for a story about women in astronomy or disability in astronomy, these groups all have websites with profiles, often email addresses, so you can find contact details of the chair people or of the members of these committees, so you can find interviewees relatively easy. And these people often put their names out there so that people can find them, right? So if you're interested in a story about disabled astronomy, here are people who really want to talk about this particular issue. These kinds of stories are important, but I think they're also interesting, also because they're often flashpoints for conflicts. So for a long time, you've had controversies surrounding issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you write about them, sometimes these flashpoints can be a good starting point for a science story. So, for instance, like even going back to the 1980s, there were questions, there were discussions about whether pin-up pictures should be allowed in astronomical observatories, whether something like that would count as sexual harassment, for instance. And you can find those correspondences in the newsletters of the American Astronomical Society, for example. The islands of Hawaii have also seen often astronomical conflict. Big observatories nowadays are often built on mountaintops, where there is a beautiful view of the stars, beautiful views of the heavens, and often these mountaintops are considered holy, so sacred by a lot of indigenous people. This is certainly true in the case of Hawaii, where there has been a lot of indigenous resistance to colonization more broadly by the United States, and then in particular also to observatory building. This is discussed in various media, so you can look up the 30-meter telescope, for instance, and you can find various stories related to controversies about building observatories. You may also remember, for instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were the George Floyd protests in the United States. and the very broad Black Lives Matter movement that existed in many different countries. And there were strikes for Black lives, shut down academia was one of the hashtags that was promoted on Twitter, where many people wanted to draw attention to the discrimination, for instance, of Black people in American higher education and science. As you can imagine, with these kinds of flashpoints, with these controversies, but there were also different opinions. There was criticism, so sometimes diversity activists have received pushback, encountered backlashes and so on. And sometimes this back and forth, so where you have activists but also opposition, this can be really, really interesting for a science story where you have discussion, where you have people taking different views. So for instance, about like quotas, right? Whether a scientific institution should have quotas for women, right? Whether whether there should be, for instance, 30% or 50% or 60% of new hires in an institution being women. And there are opinions pro and con whether quotas are helpful for achieving better gender representation. Sexual harassment is another topic that has attracted some controversies, and there again different opinions on how to deal with sexual harassment, how to end sexual harassment. So during the Black Lives Matter movement, there was also another movement that actually started somewhat earlier, that's called the Me Too movement, where women in different countries made it public, for instance, when they were sexually harassed, including at universities, including at scientific institutions, and sometimes perpetrators, sometimes, or suspects, people who were accused of committing harassment, they were publicly shamed and named. So people would put the names of suspects on the internet, on Twitter, on other social media services. And again, there are pros and cons, whether that's the best way to help women, to support women, to promote safety, and whether that's the best way or not to end harassment, for instance. When it comes to issues like the strike for Black lives, there have also been different opinions, where some people said, well, we really need to end discrimination in society at large, and also in science specifically, to just make the Earth a better place and to make science a better activity. However, there are other people who felt that science should be free from ideologies. But some people feared that there's some of these ideologies that have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion come from a leftist stance or a Marxist stance, and that conservative voices in particular felt that science should be as objective as possible, that politics should not come into science at all. So again, there are different viewpoints in different countries. So if you're writing about any of these issues, it's also probably interesting to find and interview people from different sides. This is one opinion piece, for instance, in the Wall Street Journal, which is a conservative American newspaper that criticizes the strike for Black lives or the shutdown STEM or shutdown academia, calls that happened during the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, maybe you think, oh, some of these topics, Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, they seem relatively recent. However, just like astronomy has a very, very long history, so does post-war, so does activism in science. So, for instance, a celebrated astronomer from the 20th century called Harlow Shapley. He was the director of the Harvard University Observatory. He was also an activist, and he argued that a scientist should go outside the laboratory, that a scientist should go outside the observatory, and they should engage in political activism as well. He also wrote, for instance, that there is one world of the stars, that the heavens are indeed united, that there's, well, even if we talk about the first world or the second world or the third world and so on, that there's only one world of the stars. And he was somebody who was very politically engaged, very politically involved, even at an institution like Harvard, which in itself can be quite elitist and quite conservative. Now, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? It probably exists in all scientific fields, in all academic disciplines. So if you're not interested in astronomy, for instance, you can write about women in chemistry, or you can write about disabled people in biology, or you could write about minority groups in botany, or whatever it is. However, I think what is interesting in astronomy in particular is that astronomy has these global aspects, these international aspects, that for a very, very long time already, there have been calls to internationalize astronomy, to make astronomy more diverse and inclusive across the world, right? That astronomy in particular should be open to people from every country, from every passport. Going back to 1945, so the end of World War II, there have been calls, for instance, on for an international observatory named after Copernicus, in which Copernicus should not be commemorated as a German or Polish scholar, but that he should be commemorated as a terrestrial, as a person from Earth. And I feel that's how a lot of astronomers would identify. Astronomers would identify as people from a planet, from the planet Earth. So I think a lot of astronomers would have this global identity, maybe even more so than lots of scientists from other disciplines. The International Astronomical Union has then long studied the possibility of international observatories. There has been funding from UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. I mentioned committees earlier. The International Astronomical Union has a committee for the exchange of astronomers that, again, was established after World War II in order to facilitate travel. So people from the East going to the West, people from the global South going to the global North. This is something that has been institutionalized among professional astronomers, but it also is a passion for amateur astronomers too. So there have been not just professional organizations like the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, but also organizations like Astronomers Without Borders that have tried to promote a view of Earth as being united, that we are one people, and we have one sky, and that nobody owns these objects in space outside of low Earth orbit, right? That nobody owns the moon, nobody owns the sun, nobody owns Venus or Mars or any of the stars, that everything is shared by all of humanity. One important figure here is Mike Simmons, who is the founder of Astronomers Without Borders. He is an American astronomer who traveled widely, including widely in the Middle East to places like Iran, Iraq, and many others. One of the projects of Astronomers Without Borders was a project called The World at Night, The World at Night, or TWAN, in which astronomers, astrophotographers, and others were trying to photograph the different monuments, cultural monuments of Earth under the sky. And you could see in these photographs how the Milky Way appears, for instance, over every country, how the sun, of course, appears over every country, reminding us how Earth and sky can be united. The collaborator of Mike Simmons was here an Iranian astrophotographer called Babak Tafreshi. Here it says, dazzling Venus hovers in the Texas twilight just hours after it is seen by skies gazers in Iran. The familiar stars of Ursa Major transit the Vatican domes just as they do the spires of a Buddhist temple in China. The magnificent Milky Way arches above Arizona's Grand Canyon on the same night it's seen by Nepal's inhabitants gracing the sky above the Himalayan mountains. These are views that connect all of us and can help create understanding and friendship, right? So astronomy is really also then a discipline that can provide hope. In 1945, the world was very divided after Second World War, after the beginning of the world, at the beginning of the Cold War. Now the world seems to be divided again, right, between the United States, Europe, Russia, Iran, China, etc. However, space is still one of those areas where humans from all nations can still collaborate. So, for instance, the Russian government and the American governments, they don't have a lot of collaborative science projects anymore, but they still collaborate on the International Space Station, the ISS. So that's still something that they share. So space is indeed one of those areas that continues to bring all countries together, even the countries whose governments don't always agree with one another. I talked about various identity groups in this talk earlier on, that yes, we have different identities. We might identify as men or as women. We might identify as black or white or brown. We might identify as Muslims or Christians or Jewish or Hindus or Buddhists. We might identify as able-bodied or disabled. However, we should not let those identities divide us, right? Instead, this movement for diversity and inclusion has hopefully taught us that people from all identity groups should be in solidarity with one another. They should be supportive of one another. And astronomy can offer the sense of a planetary identity, that what we all share is that we're all people of one particular planet. We all have the same address. We're all people who live on Earth. And so we hopefully, by understanding Earth better, understanding our planet better, understanding our place in the cosmos better, we can really be proud of our shared humanity. So I feel these kinds of stories, if you want to write stories about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right, you can write them in a way that they're not just of interest to people from a specific group. So if you want to write about women in astronomy, you can write the story that it's not just a story that's interesting for women. If you're writing about disabled astronomers, disabled scientists, you can write the story in a way that it's not just interesting to other disabled people, but you can, especially by focusing on astronomy, focus on the fact that this is a human story. This is a story about Earth, about the people on our planet. And if you interview astronomers, they can probably tell you a lot about this planetary identity. Thank you, everybody. I would like to thank Sadiqa again, and Fawz in particular. Also, my office mate Bayrat. I'm speaking from our office. I'm thanking my research assistants and also my various interviewees. Thank you very much, everybody, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Professor Determann. This has been the most comprehensive overview from the historical context that I have ever had, and it was an amazing presentation with starting from the exclusivity part till inclusivity part. However, whatever the work is being done, and a lot of things you have mentioned throughout the social movements and how people have been trying to make a difference. And this was really amazing, I think. And okay, so one question would be from my side. Since you mentioned about this thing, the quota thing about the 50% of hiring for women uh, for the long-term future. So what are the pros and cons of, because the argument comes from the both way. But I think truly it is important for the inclusion of women since it has not been done in the past. So how do you see it?
Thank you so much. So I think a lot of people would agree on that. In science, we need better representation of women, right? So that we need more women in general in science, more women in leadership roles. So for instance, as department chairs at universities, or as maybe university presidents, or as observatory directors, and so on. We need more women as principal investigators of science projects. So that is the goal that a lot of people share. The opinion is somewhat divided about how to get to this goal. Right, one possibility is quotas, where you say, well, we are just appointing 50% of all university presidents need to be women. 50% of all department chairs positions at university need to be women, and so on. The pro of that was that you can achieve this equity relatively quickly, right? If you say, well, from now on, for instance, we will only appoint university presidents until we have 50% women. That would be probably very, very fast. You would get to then 50% of women very, very quickly. The criticism is that you might then also not necessarily have the best qualified candidate, right? If you're then excluding qualified male candidates because you want to have only women candidates at this point in time. So the one criticism is that you're just excluding qualified male candidates, and as a result, the science might suffer. Another criticism might be that, if a woman now gets appointed, she might get criticized that, oh, she was only appointed because she was a woman, right? And that might actually harm her, right? Where she then might get associated just with that quota. People might speak behind her back and say, well, she was appointed because she's a woman, but not because she's a good scientist. While the aim is the same, that we need more women, for instance, in leadership roles, there are differences about what's the best mechanism of how to get there. Should we have a quota or should we not?
Okay, I have a question.
Yes, please ask.
You said we need better representation of women, but does it mean we will lose our merit? And also, we should focus on merit instead of identity. Science does not require any women or any other gender for advancement. Rather, it requires quality research. If a man does a quality research, he is better for the role, and he should be focused, not women.
Thank you so much. So yeah, like in the interest of justice and fairness, yes, it is right that that the best qualified person should be appointed to a specific role. That if you have well, somebody who is the most capable person for a job, yes, they should be chosen, regardless of their identity. And indeed, astronomy can help us maybe focus on the common identity that we all have, right? Astronomers can remind us that we're all humans from Earth, right? That we should not focus too much on the other identity groups that might divide us. We should not focus maybe too much on gender, but we should keep the global view in mind. On the other hand, we have to recognize that science is not just an activity that takes place in isolation from other societal challenges. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier that at least traditionally, a lot of astronomers would work at night. They would work alone. They would work in remote locations, right? And there are safety issues there that are more pertinent for women, right? So if you have, let's say, a male astronomer and a female astronomer, and they're both working at night, looking at the stars, and they have to come home safely. Unfortunately, we don't live in a world where the man is as safe as the woman, or the woman is as safe as the man, right? Ideally, we need to create these conditions where women feel as safe as men in the laboratory, at the university, and so that they don't have to worry about harassment or crimes, right? And sort of once everybody feels safe, right? Once everybody feels supported, then we have sort of a level playing field. Then we can say, okay, now we can see who does the best work. And then we can choose the best people for the work. But we need to make sure that that safety for all groups is assured at the beginning.
Thank you for your answer. It is quite an argument from the point of view. As you mentioned, there are a lot of other aspects that we have to consider in before weighing in our argument. And more importantly, there is another question, Professor Matthias. It is, even though we know that there are skies for everyone, there is a high chance of certain races excelling in space exploration due to economic reasons. Economic reasons are also there when we are working in space. How can we make space exploration more inclusive from the economic aspect?
Thank you. That's a really, really good question as well. Yes, we are all sharing the same sky, right? We could all see the same objects in the sky: the sun, the moon, Venus, Mars, etc. However, our resources for doing research are not equally distributed, right? So we don't have the same kind of telescopes everywhere. We don't have the same kinds of computers everywhere. So I think what we need to do then is to remove barriers, right? In order to make sure that research data, research instruments are accessible. So something that is already quite positive is that NASA, for instance, has made a lot of its data available online. So if you have an internet connection, you can access a lot of astronomical data, and you can run all kinds of calculations on them. If you're a good programmer, if you're somewhere in Pakistan or somewhere else, you can access that NASA data and you can write an algorithm. You can use AI in order to search for patterns, and you can make a publication, and you can do whatever you want with that data, right? Astronomical data is kind of copyright free, right? It's unlike, for instance, like other data about human beings where you have to worry about data privacy and so on. With astronomical data, you can do with that data whatever you want. So that's already a good thing. However, money obviously is still a big issue, right? That if you come from a poor country, either the money needs to come to you, or you need to be able to go to where the money is. And that's why I think it's also important to remove those barriers related to nationalities and borders and visas, right? That often, if you're from a poor country, from a global south country, it's harder for you often to get a visa to work in Europe, or to work in America, or to work in just in a richer country more generally. And that's why I think it's important to have institutes, organizations like UNESCO, but also like Astronomers Without Borders, that help with travel, that provide funds and provide support so that these resources can be more shared. So these travel grants by the International Astronomical Union, so that if you are an astronomer from a poor country, but you have a good idea, that you receive the money so that you can travel to a richer place to do your work. And also the other way around, that if there are telescopes available in a richer place, that maybe those telescopes should also be shared, that maybe one should ship those telescopes to poorer countries, sometimes where the observing conditions are better too. So for instance, rich countries are often places that are highly industrialized, places with a lot of light pollution. So you can't actually, there's a lot of money in New York City, for instance, but in New York City, you can't observe the sky very well because there's light pollution and other pollution. So it would be much better if you have a telescope in New York to probably ship that somewhere to rural Pakistan, but where you have a much better view of the Milky Way. So hopefully if we can remove the barriers of borders and sort of have money and people move freely to where the money and the people are needed and useful, then we will make progress.
Well, that is amazing. Thank you for highlighting the barriers and the solutions that we can do to combine and have the global connectivity and the collaboration that could happen. More importantly, another question is, what are some key initiatives, particularly in science, that are addressing these issues? I think you have highlighted a lot, but if you would like to mention others, so would be amazing. How are you?
Like other initiatives as well. So, for instance, I'm part of a working group of the International Astronomical Union about star names. As you know, there are billions of stars in our Milky Way, and there are billions of galaxies in the universe. And most of these stars don't actually have names. The brightest stars have names, and they have names probably in every culture. So in every language of the world, there's probably a name for the sun. But a lot of the other stars, the fainter stars, the smaller stars, the stars that we can only see with a telescope. Many of them, they don't have names, they only have numbers given to them by scientists. So I'm actually part of a working group that tries to give names to these stars that currently only have numbers. And we have people from all over the world in that working group. So we have Americans and we have Chinese people, and the Americans and the Chinese, they talk to one another, they collaborate despite sometimes the political tensions. And we're trying to make sure that the names that we choose are inclusive from every culture. So we're trying to find names from different cultures. So we are not just trying to find only Arabic names or only French names or only English names, only Russian names, but we're trying to sort of get to a balance where every culture continues to see itself in the sky. And there are campaigns as well by the International Astronomical Union, where everybody can suggest names. So if you search for a campaign called Name Exoworlds, for instance, this is a campaign especially about naming stars that have planets. And really everybody can contribute. You don't need to be a scientist. You don't need to be an adult. You could be a child. And you can have a name for a star. Send us that name recommendation. And the International Astronomical Union can consider it. So this is another way where we're trying to remove barriers, right? You don't need to have a PhD in order to contribute to knowledge about the stars. You have a good name for the stars, whoever you are, wherever you are, and send us your suggestions.
Well, this has been really an amazing talk, and there are a lot of feedback here. Khatija says very well. Gul said, thank you for the comprehensive response, a very detailed, informative. A lot of feedback is within the messages. Okay, Shahir, your last question you can ask. Then in the meantime, we will end the session.
Okay. I will just say quickly my question. How should we address faced by the gender minorities in STEM? Is a solution to force the increased participation from the underrepresented groups to achieve better representation, or is it just a societal issue?
That's a good question. So I think society and science are just very well connected, right? Because scientists live in a society, right? So if you, for instance, you have a man or a woman, they live in a society, and the society can support, but they can also restrict. Sometimes can, for instance, take young girls, for instance, the society and family and so on, they can support women and girls, but they can also restrict them, right? But they can restrict their movement. For instance, a family might not allow a young woman to travel abroad for studies and so on. I think, and if society does not allow many women to get a good education, then we're struggling to find places for them in research too. So take, for instance, Pakistan's neighboring country of Afghanistan, right, where it's now very difficult for girls to get a formal education. So it's if, let's say, we want more Afghan women in science, yes, we could try to force that through and just try to appoint Afghan women to leadership positions, but ideally we also need to sort of change society in a way where all Afghan girls can go to school, where all Afghan girls have access to knowledge, have access to the internet, and so on. And I think that's also why it's important for scientists maybe to become activists. That's why it's important for scientists to also go out and try to change society, try to support women. For instance, if there is a community that's trying to restrict access, for instance, to women, then maybe scientists should stand up and say, no, it is really important in every country of the world that girls can go to school and that girls can go to universities. And yeah, so hopefully scientists can help change society, and if society becomes more supportive, then that also helps science.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you, Professor Determann, for highlighting this thing, that how, as scientists, we must be very responsible about our duty within the society, and to make a difference, to create spaces for the people who are not do not have the required representation within the scientific community. All about your presentation from exclusivity and inclusivity. We really enjoyed it, and thank you for joining us. And we would like to reconnect again. It was amazing. The presentation was very comprehensive. All the feedback came in the same direction. So thank you for thank you for your talk.
Thank you so much, and I'm so happy to be speaking to all of you. So if any of you come to Qatar, please let me know. Qatar has quite a big Pakistani community as well. Also, if any of you would like to connect with me on social media, if you would like to connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, and please do so. If you would like to send me an email, I would love to stay connected with all of you.
I will surely share. I will surely share this stuff with our team and entire cohort. I'm also connected with you. You are very frequent with sharing your stuff and all the amazing stuff about science and astronomy. And would love to reconnect again.
Wonderful. Can't wait. Please drop your LinkedIn details. I think it says here, if you just search for my name.